one of the best parts about a Five Nights at Freddy's game is honestly what it changes about what we know about other Five Nights at Freddy's games. The whole franchise at this point can feel like a sort of non-Euclidean liquid, morphing and shifting based on the inputs around it. And one example about that, I think, is what Help Wanted 2 informs us about Security Breach and Ruin. And that's what we're here to discuss today, so slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. Before we know about what changed with Help Wanted 2, we need to know about what is changing, specifically about Security Breach and its endings. The game itself presents us with 6 different endings, and the debate for the longest time was which one was canon, especially with 2 of the endings in particular, the Burn Trap ending and the Princess Quest ending. I love the subtle continuity that you guys can tell that I record the green screen segments after I record the non-green screen segments, because there's so much more white fur on my apron after holding Mark for like 20 minutes. I would argue that the most commonly held theory was that the Burn Trap ending was the canon one, where you go back into the Pizzaplex after 6 AM, get the other Freddy upgrade, go under the Roxy Raceway and confront Burn Trap and Tangle in a boss fight, after which the Pizzaplex collapsed, the Tangle scooping up Burn Trap and running, and Gregory and Freddy making it outside. Honestly, it's always been a good candidate for the canon ending. It's the only ending that's fully animated, the others being comic book pages. It's the ending that requires the most outside 6 AM stuff to do, and I'd argue is the hardest to get, especially before they added save stations after 6 AM, because for a while, once you got to 6 AM, you couldn't save anymore. So you had to do pretty much a third of the game without saving, which is brutal. Not to mention that it also feels the most final thematically, fully upgrading Freddy, going to the base of the issue, and having an actual honest-to-God boss fight. Thinking that this is the canon ending is a totally valid interpretation, but I had for a while thought that the Princess Quest ending was actually the canon one. The ending where if you beat Princess Quest 1 and 2 and saw the Vanny hideout during your playthrough, you could then do a chase sequence towards Vanny's hideout and play Princess Quest 3. Upon beating it, Vanessa seems to be freed from Vanny, and her, Gregory, and Freddy's head go off to that same hill and eat some ice cream. And when I say I think it's a better fit for it being the canon ending, it's mainly because of what it sets up for the future of the franchise. It would give us 2 main characters to pick from, both of which have a history with Afton, and it lets us keep the character and knowledge of Glamrock Freddy without having to reuse that same mechanic because now his body is gone. And honestly, this is just like fanfiction territory, but I think one of the coolest ways they can take this franchise moving forward is if the next game does include these 3 characters, but Fazbear as a company is still doing something shady. So now at the new Fazbear restaurant, Vanessa, Gregory, and Freddy's head essentially have to do a heist, where Vanessa tries to get hired, Gregory pretends to be a normal kid, and they're trying to connect Freddy to the mainframe or something. I don't know, I think that would make for a really compelling game. Regardless, to be honest, as far as evidence for this theory goes, that's kind of light. I don't think there's anything that necessarily proves that it's the canon ending. The only evidence I could come up with before Ruin and Help Wanted 2 was that it's the only 3-star ending. And like, that's cool and all, but that isn't really necessarily evidence that it's canon. But then, Ruin came out. Security Breach got a free DLC expansion, Ruin, this past summer, and it added on more obscurity to the whole situation, because once again, it argued for a couple different endings, but this time it actually gave evidence that Princess Quest could be the canon ending for Security Breach. And on the surface, Ruin seemed to be directly telling us that that was the canon ending. After all, you can collect comic pages that are stated to be made by Gregory as a representation of every other ending in the game except for the Princess Quest ending. Not only that, but when we see the Princess Quest 3 arcade machine, it's toppled on its side and an AR sword is stuck through it, implying that it's been vanquished or beaten. And deeper in Phaser Blast, we see a headless Freddy in the same exact position and damage that he would have been in at the end of the Vanny ending. And Vanny, who would have been freed with the Princess Quest ending, is nowhere to be found in Ruin. Like, it seems really cut and dry, but if you look a little bit closer, it's not. It's uncut and moist. After all, Vanny isn't here, but there's Vanny graffiti all throughout the Pizzaplex. Freddy's in the same spot as the Vanny ending, but it's a Freddy with a prototype stamp on his foot, implying it might not even be the same one. Not to mention, the entire Pizzaplex is fallen to ruin, pun intended. And the only endings that can pretty much guarantee that happens are the Burn Trap ending and the Fire Escape ending. Not to mention, once you get down to the FNAF 6 location, Burn Trap is nowhere to be found. Now, I hear you, right? There's a comic page of Burn Trap and the Tangle, so doesn't that imply that Burn Trap and the Tangle are complete manifestations of Gregory's mind? They're just something he came up with while doing these weird coping comics. And as much as I want to write that off and just say yes, definitely, I can't. Because at the beginning of Ruin, we see the tangle. It slithers away, it got out, and it looks identical to that page on the comic. So even though at first the comic page seems to imply that Gregory made the whole thing up, the fact that the comic page is accurate implies he actually saw what's on it, aka the burn trap ending. Not only all of this, but Ruin itself has multiple endings, because of course it does. And it doesn't clarify at all which one is probably canon. In one of them, Gregory betrays us and ends up dropping the elevator to keep the mimic locked in, and we even find out that Gregory has a friend who somehow knows the layout of these caves. However, the pronoun of this friend is deliberately hidden. There's static when Gregory goes to say it. So a lot of us assume this to be Vanessa and the pronoun would be she, but theoretically it could be he, they, or anything else. So with all this information, what's the deal? What ending is Ruin saying is canon? It kind of goes either way. I think at the time after Ruin, I was pretty set in stone that Princess Quest happened. Maybe Burn Trap did too, but at least the Princess Quest ending definitely happened. But that was before Help Wanted 2 came out. But before we do, I just want to take a second to mention that this video is sponsored by Airup. If you've been watching the channel for a while now, you've probably heard me talk about these guys a lot, and I'm not stopping now. Airup has legitimately made a difference in the way I consume water. For anyone who hasn't heard about them yet, Airup has revolutionized our drinking habits. Their bottle and flavor pods make water taste better without adding anything to it. And that's because Airup flavors water through scent. Yeah, let me show you. These flavor pods go around the straw of the bottle right here. When pressed fully down, you just drink regular water. But if you pull the flavor pod up into position, the scent of the flavor pod enters the straw and goes into your mouth with the water, and your brain registers that as flavor. You don't have to tilt or anything like that, and the flavors are great. Right now I'm drinking lemon raspberry, but I also love their lime, blueberry, wildberry. I'm really fruity. But if you want to try Airup for yourself, go ahead and click the link in the description to get yourself a bottle and some flavor pods today. Thanks again to Airup for sponsoring today's video. It seems that most of the fandom can agree that Help Wanted 2 is showing us what Cassie's dad, who I believe is called Jeremy, was doing in the lead up to Ruin. The debate sparks when considering about what exactly he was doing. To me, it seems clear that Cassie's dad was digging into what was actually going on at the Pizzaplex and trying to fix it. After all, we know from the Security Breach duffel bags that somebody was going through the arcade machines and trying to essentially expose the glitches in them, and that someone was likely an employee at the Pizzaplex. Cassie's dad fits both of those bills. A Fazbear mega fan who works at the Pizzaplex makes so much sense. To add on to this, in Help Wanted 2, we play Princess Quest 4. And if this arcade machine works the same way that Princess Quest 1, Princess Quest 2, and Princess Quest 3 works, then presumably for Princess Quest 4 to be able to be activated, Princess Quest 1 through 3 have to be activated and beaten. And to be fair, we know that by the time of Ruin that at least Princess Quest 3 is beaten, which backs up this fact. The thing is, what's in that third machine? The princess's sword. And the only character who has canonically wielded that sword besides literally the princess in the arcade machine is Jeremy. I'm honestly wondering if Jeremy, our player, Cassie's dad, was the one to beat all of the Princess Quest arcade machines in the canon events of the timeline. But that's not all, because he might be responsible for the redesigns that the animatronics received for Ruin. We know from the Roxy Salon hard mode that Jeremy is the one who puts the weird mask that we see on Roxy before Ruin. But that's not the only hint towards Jeremy doing things to the animatronics that make them look the way they do in Ruin. One detail that always bugged me about the non-AR version of the lobby in Help Wanted 2 is Chica's hand on the main stage. It's practically the center of attention. It's literally on a stage. It has to mean something. But what? Well, what else does Jeremy do to Chica throughout this game? Feed her with food, cheese, trash, and pizza, and all sorts of stuff. And what does Chica look like in Ruin? Filled up with cheese, trash, and missing the shell of that hand. I think implying that whatever Jeremy was doing during Help Wanted 2 is the reason Chica looks like this. So we have direct and indirect evidence that Jeremy is the reason that Roxy and Chica look like that in Ruin. What about the other two? Well, I'll be totally honest, we really have zero information on Monty or Freddy going into Ruin in Help Wanted 2. But we do have some logical assumptions we can make for Monty. We know from Cassie that Bonnie was Cassie's dad's favorite animatronic, and I'm gonna be so real, guys. If you still don't think Monty is the one that destroyed Bonnie, I think you're coping. Like, it's valid to think other things, but if you don't think it's possible that Monty was the one that destroyed Bonnie, I mean, like, we literally see Bonnie's head got caved in with a bowling ball, and in Bonnie Bowling Help Wanted 2, when you get a gutter ball, there's a Bonnie bowling ball that gets crushed by a Monty bowling ball. Like, at this point, it feels canon. It feels confirmed. It technically isn't, but it feels confirmed. Not to mention, if that's true and Monty was the one to destroy Bonnie and Cassie's dad knew, when Cassie's dad sees Monty at the end of Security Breach when he's this weird, pitiful heap, he might have taken some revenge on Bonnie, avenged him a little bit. That's why Monty looks so demolished when it comes to Ruin. And like, that's possible, but again, there's no evidence for that. It's just a logical conclusion. But then, what about Freddy? And honestly, this one's kind of a loose end. After all, the only time we see him at all in Help Wanted 2 is in cold storage. And in that minigame, he's perfectly normal. He doesn't even look like he does at the end of Security Breach. For now, honestly, the only answer I can think of is that Freddy does escape with Gregory at the end of Security Breach, and is then replaced with an older model, explaining the prototype stamp we see in Ruin. Especially if Jeremy was the one to beat the Princess Quest 3 arcade machine, then we know this ending didn't happen the way we saw it in Security Breach, explaining some of these inconsistencies. But speaking of those inconsistencies, what about Vanny in all of this? She's an interesting case to be sure, because on one hand, the Security Breach Princess Quest ending shows that Vanessa is freed, but then on the other hand, there's Vanny graffiti all over Ruin, and we see her at the end of Help Wanted 2. So there is the chance that the Princess Quest 3 arcade machine didn't destroy Vanny at all, but we do know from Ruin that this was the one ending that doesn't come from Gregory's mind. So what gives? Well, what gives might be B7-2, Vanny, and the way that the Mimic 1 program functions. This video is already going to be long enough, so I'm not going over the full plot of B7 and its sequel. Frankly, there's plenty of reasons why I don't want to, but this is one of them.
Something about having a cat is you're never sure if they've got like a weird scab or if they have a tick or something. It's a weird scab.
The important thing to note, however, is that in B7, a robotic persona was forming inside the mind of the main character, and by the beginning of B7-2, that robotic persona was separated from him. Everything that he was while the persona was a part of him was sanctioned off into this new entity, an entity that needed and craved a host. It tried to get the main character to host it again, but was denied. Do you see where I'm going with this? What if it's not that beating Princess Quest 3 destroys Vanny, freeing Vanessa, but rather it frees Vanessa by separating her from Vanny? After all, it seems likely that Vanny is just a manifestation of the Mimic 1 program inside of the mind of Vanessa. So it's not necessarily that Vanny is a character, but rather Vanny is the manifestation of the Mimic 1 program replicating within someone's mind. If that's true, whatever was left of Vanny is likely trying to find a new host, and that program resides in the VANNI mask. That same mask that our character, Jeremy Fitzgerald, Cassie's dad, picks up and uses for Help Wanted 2. Maybe Vanny was testing out Jeremy as a host, but instead decided to go after Cassie. Realistically, that's a full theory for another day, but for now, this could explain why Vanny is still around after the Princess Quest 1 through 3 machines are beaten, yet still allow for the Princess Quest ending from Security Breach to not be canon. So again, what is the canon ending of Security Breach? Well, one other detail that might shed some light on that answer can be found at the end of Ruin. A detail that always kind of didn't make sense to me. Gregory's labeled backpack in the room right outside of the Mimic. Now, this scene in insulation makes sense, right? We have a collapsed ventilation shaft, a cemented over door, empty cement bags, and a backpack labeled Gregory. This scene very easily explains, hey, Gregory went in there, somebody cemented the door behind him once the Mimic went in after him, he snuck out through the vent and collapsed it on the way behind him, trapping the Mimic in this room. The problem is, when did this happen? Gregory does not have that backpack in Security Breach, so it couldn't have happened during the game. Logically speaking, it would have had to happen before or after Security Breach. And after doesn't make a lot of sense because pretty much every ending deals with Gregory getting the hell out of there. Why would he immediately go back in and to the depths of it afterwards? So then if it's not after, what about before? And that does make a lot of sense. If we lean on GGY being close to the game's timeline continuity, then Gregory would have at some point also been subservient to the Mimic 1 program, just like Vanny. Click this video if you want the full big breakdown on why that's possible, because we do not have time to recover those grounds. You know, just thinking of it now, if Gregory and Vanny were working together before the events of Security Breach, I wonder if this line from the trailer,
"You will bring me what I want, and if you fail me, then you will, both of you, burn!"
was actually talking to Vanny and Gregory, because both of you is still a weird line. Regardless, their goal within Security Breach is to bring Glitchtrap into the physical realm, and if they went down to the FNAF 6 location and encountered the Mimic, well, that presents a problem. Sure, the Mimic is a good potential candidate for a body for Glitchtrap, but if the novels are to be believed at all, the Mimic, the physical Mimic, is incredibly violent and very hard to work with. It might have been decided that that was too much of a liability, not an asset, and instead, Gregory and Vanny were the ones to trap the Mimic in that basement. Which would mean Gregory doesn't have to come back to the Pizzaplex at all after Security Breach, but subconsciously he would know the image and location of Burntrap. So yeah, I accidentally gave evidence that both the Burntrap ending and the Princess Quest ending aren't necessarily proven to be true. So for the last time, which one happened? And at this point, honestly, I think kind of both. But as far as what we see on screen, the Burntrap ending. If Jeremy truly is the one to modify the animatronics from the end of Security Breach into what they look like at the beginning of Ruin, and beat the arcade machines including Princess Quest 1 through 3, then the Princess Quest ending is redundant. Not to mention that that ending in the way we see it doesn't necessitate all the Glamrocks to be destroyed, just 2 out of the 3. Meanwhile, the Burntrap ending necessitates all 3 are damaged and Freddy goes missing. If Jeremy is still there, working for Fazbear using the Vanny mask, he might have tried to repair the Pizzaplex by replacing Freddy with that older prototype model. In that Burntrap ending, the Tangle scoops up Burntrap and leaves, which we see in Ruin. The building starts to crumble and fall apart, which we see in Ruin. And we even get an answer for Gregory's friend. Like I said, the pronoun that he uses gets muffled. That pronoun could be a he, the friend being Glamrock Freddy, someone who would know the layout of the building. In a way, technically you could argue that both the Princess Quest ending and the Burntrap ending happen, but Gregory isn't the one to do both of them. Gregory does the Burntrap ending, but in between Security Breach and Ruin, Jeremy Fitzgerald, Cassie's dad during Help Wanted 2, completes the Princess Quest ending. So that's my answer. Funny enough, when we had all the evidence that pointed to Burntrap ending being canon way in the beginning of Security Breach, I had a hunch that it was the Princess Quest ending that was actually the canon one, and now that we have more evidence that suggests the Princess Quest ending is the canon one, I'm leaning towards the Burntrap ending. Maybe I'm just contrarian, who knows? Regardless, what do you think the canon ending is of Security Breach? I'm so curious. Feel free to leave a comment. I try to go through as many as I can. In the meantime, if you want to know what I actually think about Help Wanted 2 as a real game, not like a lore standpoint thing, you can go ahead and watch this video, which is actually some media critique for once on the channel. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to post it with hashtag #RightHeart so I can find it. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.